I suppose it's best to start with the big picture.
Here's a compilation of the best of Michael Saylor from more than 100 hours of interviews. Allow me to just say that Michael Saylor is my favorite exponential CEO. His openness and ability to articulate his strategy is a gift, and we can all learn and study from his thinking. Here I give you the controversial but genius and extremely focused Michael Saylor. Here's a video from September 10th, 2011. This is many years before he even heard about Bitcoin. Already in this clip, you can see Michael Saylor questioning everything.
The big picture for me was punctuated this morning by this profound sense of disruption and anxiety I felt when I woke up and I looked around the room. And it's fascinating when you find yourself at a transition point or an inflection point in life, and you look backwards and you see all these things, objects, metaphors, processes that you live with that were so normal, so expected, and so comforting. And then you look forward and you can't imagine any of them being relevant to you ever again. I guess it's that sense you have when you transition from your life as a high school student to your life as a college student. You leave behind everything that you knew in your world, and you move into a new world where everything is different and strange. And that's what I felt this morning, because I got up, I looked around, and I saw a computer, and I thought to myself, you know, since I got an iPad, I've probably sat down at a computer 2% as often. My usage of a computer went from 100 hours to 2 hours. 98% of what it used to do for me became irrelevant, and it's just sitting there gathering dust. And then I looked at a bunch of books, and I thought, you know, in the last year, I haven't really felt a need or desire to buy a single book or carry a book. And I looked at magazines, and I thought, why would I ever take a magazine anywhere? And I looked at a bookshelf, and I thought, well, if I don't have a book, why do I have a bookshelf? And then I looked at the desk that this stuff was sitting on, the computer and the books, and there's a comic book there, and there was a magazine, and there was some paper. I thought, well, if I don't have any of those things, I don't need the desk. I looked at the trash can next to the desk, and I thought, well, if I don't have the desk and I don't have the paper, I don't have the books, I have nothing to throw away, so I don't need the trash can. And I looked at the chair in front of the desk, and I wondered why I would want the chair there. It went on like that as I just began to think about all the things in my life that I grew up with, that I found comforting, that might be representations of my ego or my self-worth or my erudition or affluence. A large library or a large desk or a nice chair or a big computer with a big screen. And I thought, well, if I don't have that to display, then what does my life consist of? And the fact that I felt that this morning when I got up, even today, is shocking, because I'm in the technology business for the last 20 years, so I shouldn't be feeling that, and yet I do. I feel a profound sense of disruption right now in my life. I'm building an apartment, and in the apartment, I'd laid out an area which was going to be a nice library. It'll have a lot of bookshelves and a nice table where I could put the large books on the table and chairs to sit around. And now I look at it and I think, well, what will I put in that library? And then I had another nice desk I'd set up, and I had these nice bookshelves right behind it. And then my architect designed them out. He looked at me and he said, well, you know, you don't really need those anymore. So I just took them out. And so that's going on even in the last 12 months, that I'm finding that just basic architectural decisions don't make any sense anymore. How much did it cost to listen to Beethoven's 7th Symphony, you know, in 1850? Well, you have to be a king. You have to have 100 professional musicians, right? The kings actually had their own royal orchestras.
And they hired and retained 100 musicians to be always ready to play for royalty. And I guess you can calculate what it cost. In the Western world, a full orchestra is millions of dollars a year, and you divide it by listening 20 times, and you conclude that it's extremely expensive. On the other hand, I could deliver you Beethoven's Seventh Symphony on a phonograph record for the price of the record player and the phonograph. And then when we finally dematerialized the phonograph, the record player, and the record itself, and we dropped them into a file that runs on an iPhone or an Android phone, now you could give Beethoven's Seventh Symphony to everyone for the cost of the electrons, and that's probably not even a penny. So you want to give music or culture to everybody on Earth, you got to do it digitally. That's what created the internet wave. That was very characteristic in the mobile wave. But there's a fundamental distinction between information and energy. And so I would say the first generation, the first 30 years was the digital transformation of information, and information is non-conservative. I can give you my copy of Moby Dick as a book, and I'm transferring something embedded in energy, and if I give you the book, I don't have the book. But if I send you the PDF file of Moby Dick, I still have the file and you have the file. We both have the book. So I can give all 8 billion people the book in a non-conservative way if it's information. But if there's energy in it, energy content, I have to transfer the thing from me to you. So the first 30 years of this revolution were all about digital transformation of information. And only recently we moved into the next stage, which is the digital transformation of energy. And the conservation of energy is one of the most basic laws of physics. And conservation of energy means that potential energy becomes kinetic energy, but then the potential energy is gone. When I'm up here and I dive to here, I'm no longer there. And if I could dive to here and also be there, the universe wouldn't work, right? So I think Bitcoin represents the most profound application of the creation of digital energy and the channeling of digital energy. And it's a paradigm shift because everyone that has engaged in the digital revolution and the digital transformation of anything else, all of their learning was about the transformation of information and not energy. And so they have a hard time grasping.
The number one thing I got from MIT was confidence and the ability to think for myself. That's the number one thing. My first serious formative memory of MIT is I walk into a material science class. There's 350 people in the lecture hall. The professor walks out, and he is a consultant for NASA. And he's the top of his profession. And he designed these tiles that went on the space shuttle. And he takes one of the tiles, and it's burnt. It's got streaks on it. He holds up in front of the class. He says, on the space shuttle's last reentry, this tile burned off the space shuttle. Nobody at NASA knows why, and we're not sure how to fix it. What do you think? Okay, and this is the first class, the first week, freshman year. We're all 18-year-olds, and it's a bunch of people that are like the class valedictorian from their various schools. And everybody looks at everybody, and there's a pregnant pause for 60 seconds. And you could see what's going on in people's minds, because first they're like, oh my God, is there a reading I missed? And the second thought is, wait a minute, the answer to this question is not in the back of the book. And the third, and then at some point, someone raises their hand and says, well, maybe we should reverse the composite lattices or change the material to something. And everybody goes, oh my God, that must be the bravest student in the world. And it dawns on all of us that this professor, who's the smartest in the world at what he does, working for the leading space agency in the world, doesn't have an answer to a fundamental problem. Has never been answered in the history of the human race. He's looking at a bunch of people. He expects you to think for yourself and figure it out. And he thinks maybe you can. And that idea that you can actually solve a problem for the first time in human history and you're expected to do it, and they're going to give you all the basic tools, the math, the engineering disciplines, the scientific method to do it. I think that's enormously confidence building.
If you're a Roman general and you have a trireme and has 300 rowers in it, then you're generating 30 horsepower. And if you have one of those dinky, like really small, dingy engines, you have a 70 horsepower engine behind your boat in the modern world. And we obliterated the need for for manpower and in so many areas. You know, typical cars got 300-400 horsepower. You know, think about the average person when they get 300 horsepower. It used to be 100 years ago, the rich person had 2 horsepower or 4 horsepower, carriage, and we went to the point where a poor person has 400 horsepower. And I think AI is like that, where there's a lot of people that weren't able to generate perfect legal documents or prose or perfect business letters or a witty rap, and now anybody can. And in fact, the person that uses the AI will probably look more intelligent than the actual talented person that doesn't. And so in this particular case, there was a world where the strong could dominate the weak, and then we invented the gun, and then the weak with the gun became the strong. And if you were, you could spend your entire life, training in the martial arts. But at the end of the day, when you read the book, what should I do? Well, if you really need to defend yourself, you should get a gun, right?
It was valued at like 1 times revenue plus cash. And I said, well, I have 500 million in cash. Why don't we get more credit? And the answer is cash is trash. It's Ray Dalio's quote, cash is trash. Well, why is cash trash? Well, if the money supply is expanding at 7% a year, then the risk-free hurdle rate is 7%. If you don't generate more than 7% yield on your cash, then it's devaluing. So from 2010 to 2020, the money supply expanded at 7%. So all the cash you're holding is losing 7% of its value, assuming you have a 0% interest rate or 0 yield on the cash. So you can imagine the traditional world, you invest your cash at 3% treasury yields and you get a -7, and it's like a -4%, and divide 4 into 72. And somewhere 15, 20 years out, you're going to lose half of the shareholder value in the treasury. If you do that, people might hold their nose. But after March of 2000, the money supply is expanding at 24%. The interest rate's 0. So now you have to put a forecast in place. At what rate will the money supply expand? If it expands at 20% a year and you're going to generate 0 in treasury yield, then you're looking at cutting your treasury purchasing power in half in 3.5 years.
Whoa.
Okay, now that's not trivial. So you have to find a way, if you're gonna have assets, to get over the hurdle rate. Another way to say it is, I have to invest it in a strategy which is going to appreciate faster than the money is devalued.
The cost of capital, so people understand.
Yeah.
Is that the gap between inflation and?
Really, if you can get to it a number of ways. One way to get to it is actually look at the expansion of the money supply. Yeah. And the money supply expanded maybe 7 or 8% over 100 years. And you could look at that, and then you could tack on a risk premium. I need to get that plus a risk premium. The money supply has been, if that was the case, the risk premium is normally 4 or 5%. So you go 7% plus 5% gets you to 12% cost of capital.
But the cost of capital is the cost of holding that capital and doing nothing with it. Yeah.
Another way to look at it is the S&P index might generate a 10 to 12% return. And so if I have $1 billion, my option as an investor is just put it in the S&P index and get the 12% diversified kind of quote unquote risk-free equity return. So if the company is going to keep the money
and they're going to invest it in a T-bill that generates 3% after tax, they should just give it to me. And even if I'm brainless, I just put it in the S&P index and generate 12% tax deferred. So that's the disconnect, right? You're destroying shareholder wealth if you're generating a tax deferred yield of less than 12%.
In 2020, it's like the stock is like $6 a share enterprise value. The company's enterprise value is $6 a share. And my choice is sell the company and retire, or take a risk and open my mind. And I remember I'm sitting at my poolside next to my friend Eric Weiss, and it's March and the lockdowns hit and interest rates go to zero, and and the stock market's crashing, and and all hell is breaking loose. And I say, so tell me about that Bitcoin thing again. It's like, so that's what you'll find, that when you look at people and they're one or the other, but it takes a while for a paradigm shift. You got to really need it or want it. And that's why it's an exponential process.
What is it about Bitcoin that enables it to do so much?
It's the 3 E's. It's ethics, it's economics, and it's engineering. And in ethics, it's this idea of a fair ledger and a fair asset. Satoshi created a way, Satoshi gave it away, Satoshi went away, right? If you want the roadmap for an ethical launch of a decentralized digital commodity, an open protocol for anything, it's you create it, you give it away, you disappear, right? And Prometheus is not standing around taking 10% of the revenue from fire, and suing you for patent infringement a million years after Prometheus gave us fire. Just create it, give it away, go away. And so that idea is a very profound idea, because you think about how many corporations and governments in the world where you have the bringer of truth or the bringer of the solution, and they want to stick around and benefit from it. Right? And so I think Bitcoin sets that example. The second thing is it's economically sound, right? You can create in theory, a digital commodity that's inflationary. It's like, I can create and give away a protocol that inflates 5% a year, and I can go away and disclaim beneficial ownership, but it's still messed up. Like, it's still defective. Like 5% a year means it just keeps inflating. So this simple idea, which is such an elegant idea, pick a number, don't change the number. How important is it? Well, every machine in the world works on it. Like, every computer in the world works. And if you actually want to warble 9 to be 9.5 and 9.25, and if you want deflection on the idea, it destroys the machine, right? The reason that we use steel is it doesn't deflect. The reason we use math is it doesn't deflect. So this idea of a fixed number that nobody could change, that no corporation could corrupt, that no politician could corrupt, that no political movement can corrupt, incredibly powerful. The third prong of the Bitcoin stool is engineering. And the thing that's beautiful about Bitcoin is it's a balanced, stable, engineered system. But the way you get there is by combining energy, electricity, and something thermodynamically scarce with hardware, with semiconductors, with software, right? And with cryptography. So there's like an element of math and cryptography, and there's an element of semiconductors, and you're running them with electricity. When you put all three of them together in an open protocol, then what you have is something which is stable, that spreads virally, and eventually you get, the ASIC wars. And then what happens is people build big Bitcoin mining centers, and everybody thinks, oh, that's bad, that's centralizing. But of course, the mining centers suck up so much electricity that they eventually have to run to the edge of the grid, and they're always running away from the center of civilization to the person that has the stranded energy, because you need almost zero cost energy. So what does that do? Well, that creates a
phrase balance of power, right? I mean, which is, kind of, it means a lot of different things, but we need a balance of power for the system to be stable. And how do I make it unstable? I take away the hardware component. If I go to proof of stake, all of a sudden your balance of power means, well, I don't need $5 billion a year of electricity. So that means people that have electricity are not actors. And I don't need hardware anymore. And that means that that there's no inertia from the hardware. And now I just need a software node. And now, of course, all of those nodes can be running in the Amazon cloud, or they could collapse down to 27 computers in one city. And you wouldn't know, and B, you wouldn't care. And so the system becomes very, very fragile. Aeronautical engineers are very sensitive to this. One of the reasons that they like Bitcoin, I think, is in an aircraft, you have to consider all these factors. The shape of the aircraft matters, but the avionics matter, but the balance matters, but the conditions matter. And when you design the aircraft, someone goes, yeah, I just want to change the couch. You want to change the couch and put a different couch in an aircraft. They might charge you $96,000 of engineering to actually run the weights, the balances. They got to consider, will the couch catch fire? In the event of a crash landing, right? Is the couch rated for 16 Gs? Or will the couch break loose and kill everybody? Et cetera. And so you have all of these second order, third order, fourth order concerns in aviation and aeronautical engineering. And you don't really have those concerns if you're just a hacker. And so people that are computer programmers, they just write code, it works, their world is very simple. But people that build spaceships, and people that build airplanes, they actually have to consider a circumstance where one system fails, one system gets jammed, there's a storm, there's wind shear, and all of those things are irrelevant except in the last 15 seconds of the flight when they're certainly going to kill you. And they have to design the system such that in the last 15 seconds of the flight, if such and such happens, we don't all die.
But Bitcoin's similar to that. Austin Hill said this to me. He said the engineer of Bitcoin needs to be like aircraft engineer or rocket engineering, in that you cannot have a catastrophic failure. A catastrophic bug, I mean, look, I know Bitcoin's had it in the past, but a catastrophic inflation bug could be terminal for Bitcoin.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
I totally agree. The more you know about engineering, and I think the more you know about economics, and the more you know about ethics, the more conservative and the more considerate you become about any change to the protocol. Bitcoin is magical, and it is truly the innovation. It's like a singularity because it represents the first time in the history of the human race that we managed to create a digital property, properly understood. It's easy to create something digital, right? Every coupon and every skin on Fortnite and Roblox and Apple TV credits and all these things, they're all digital something, but they're securities, right? Shares of stock are securities. Whenever anybody transfers, when you transfer money on PayPal or Apple Pay, you're transferring, in essence, a security or an IOU. Mm-hmm. And so transferring a bearer instrument with final settlement in the internet domain or in cyberspace, that's a critical thing. And anybody in the crypto world can do that. All the cryptos can do that. But what they can't do, what 99% of them fail to do, is be property. They're securities. What did Satoshi do? Satoshi figured out how to manifest something of value in cyberspace forever and transfer it without the intermediary. So what does that really mean? If you can put $1 of value in cyberspace, you can put $1 billion of value into cyberspace. And if you put $1 billion, you can put $1 trillion. And in the last 15 years, we put 1.3 trillion. Well, there's $900 trillion of traditional wealth in the world. We have opened a portal. Satoshi opened a portal, a technique, and we started seeing economic energy moving from the analog world and the traditional world, the physical world, the analog world, into the digital world, to a pure digital representation. And that's like putting payloads in orbit, right? Like I put a satellite in orbit and it circles the Earth forever. I put a satellite almost in orbit. How long can you fly? 15 hours, and then your plane crashes. So almost in orbit is 15 hours, and in orbit is 15 billion years, as far as we know, right? So there's a pretty big difference between putting something in outer space versus putting it in space. And there's a big difference between putting something in cyberspace versus leaving it in real space. J.P. Morgan said he said gold is money, everything else is credit. What he meant was, if I hand a bar of gold to you that's worth $1 million, you have $1 million of gold. But if I hand you a check that has $1 million written on it, you have an IOU. And if you go to the bank to cash the check, there may not be any money in the bank. You may not get your $1 million. But if you have the gold, you have the gold. The gold is the bearer instrument. It is the object. The check is monetary information. The gold is monetary energy. One of them is conservative. I gave you the gold bar. I don't have the gold bar. The check I wrote to you for $1 million, and you walked out of the room, so I wrote him $1 million check. And I wrote him $1 million check. And I wrote another $1 million check. And now I'm a banker. I wrote $10 million of checks. I only have $1 million. I asked for 5% interest in each one. I maybe make myself $500,000 a year in interest off of money that doesn't exist. And I maintain, that's called fractional reserve banking. And I maintain, that illusion as long as I can. And when the illusion finally comes crashing to earth, right, all of my creditors are bankrupted, right, and the economy collapses. So Satoshi finds a way to put money in cyberspace. Bitcoin is money.
The pandemic and the events that took place in March of 2020. And what you saw was Main Street shut down. It literally shut down and came to a grinding halt. And Wall Street had an initial panic and a rapid recovery, a V-shaped recovery. And so we put those two together. You had an L-shaped recovery. Main Street just shut down. And then you had a V-shaped recovery, and we call that a K. But if you decompose it, and I was very sensitive to it because on one hand, in my personal life, I'm an investor. And in my public life, I run a Main Street company. I run a software company that has people that manufactures software that does things. So what I saw was if you had a large portfolio of stocks or assets and you went into this pandemic, after the Fed ended up expanding the money supply with the interest rates going to zero and the expansion of the M2 monetary base, the money base, you found that you were actually 25, 30% wealthy or doing nothing. You could have done nothing the entire year. As long as, right, the only mistake you could have made is do something, right? If you had $1 billion and you did nothing for the entire year, you had $1.3 billion at the end of the year. On the other hand, if you had a Main Street company and you're generating, let's say, $100 million a year in cash flow and you're valued at $1 billion because of the cash flow, you would have to be generating $130 million after a year to be valued the same, because the value, the assets that the money buy is being devalued by 30%. If the currency is devalued at some rate, and the money supply expanded to 24% last year, so you could use that as your metric, or you could use the S&P 500's return as another metric. But clearly, the currency devalued, which means that if you're a Main Street company, you had to work 20% harder to get nothing. And if you're a Wall Street company, you had to do nothing to get 20% better. And so what I saw was a shift in balance of power, and a shift in wealth. And it was pretty disturbing to me too. What is inflation? I would have accepted the party line inflation as CPI. And then as soon as you realize inflation is not CPI or inflation, and you can generate as many inflation metrics as you wish to generate, then you realize, well, I can just cherry pick any inflation. And so the best possible situation is to run an economy with 12% inflation while I convince the people that it's 2% inflation, because the cost of capital really is 12%, but they think it's 2%. And the difference of the 10% I get to give to anybody else I want, right? So like every pension is indexed at CPI, so I'm raising your pensions at 2%. I'm inflating the money supply at 10 or 12%, right? And that leads you to question a lot of things. Well, if the inflation rate isn't correct, then maybe GDP isn't correct. How do you actually measure gross domestic product, if it's not inflation adjusted? What's the source of the volatility and the performance? And if you don't understand why the asset does what it does, if you don't understand the economic physics involved, then you'll think it's random, and you'll feel like the performance is risky. But I want to give you an example of a physical metaphor. I'm a hiker, and I come across a mountain lake, and the mountain lake has 500 trillion gallons of water in it. And yeah, I don't know how it got there, but it's there. The water's chilly, it's clear. And I look down, and there's a waterfall coming off the mountain lake. And the waterfall, it's very beautiful, and it's very turbulent, right? Water is turbulent in a waterfall. Water is not turbulent in a glassy lake. So the turbulence is volatility, right? And there's waterfall. And then I look at it, and now if you look and you say, I don't know why that water falls downhill. I don't know if it'll keep falling downhill, but I hate the volatility. Then I guess you can take a selfie in front of the lake, go swimming, get cold, and leave. But let's say you're not a tourist, but you're an engineer. So you come across the same lake, and you see the waterfall, and you see the 500 trillion gallons, and you think about gravity, and you think about sunlight. And now I know how the water got there. The water got there because the sun shone on the ocean. The water evaporated from the ocean. It rose up in the clouds. The wind blew it against the mountain. It condensed, and it rained into the mountain, and the water ran off the mountain into the mountain lake. I know how it got there. And then I think, well, if I create a dam near that waterfall, I build myself a dam, I put a turbine on the dam, and then I drop 1 billion gallons of water. I channel 1 billion gallons of water through the dam, drop it 60 feet. And then I plug that into a hydroelectric power plant. I spin the dynamo. I make electricity. And then if I'm really smart, I run the electric power line to a village down in the valley, and I light up the village, or I light up the city. Now, someone can come along that doesn't understand physics, and they can say, good idea, Junior, but what are you going to do when the water stops flowing downhill? Well, I'm like, well, I actually think the water's flowing downhill because of gravity. Newton solved that for me. And then someone else comes along and says, good idea, Junior, but what are you going to do when you run out of water in the lake? I'm like, well, there's 500 trillion gallons, and I take out my calculator, and 1 billion gallons or whatever, it's going to last a long time. Like, well, it's eventually going to run out. I say, well, the sun keeps shining on the ocean, and the ocean keeps lifting the water out of the ocean, and it drops it on this mountain. And that's why there's water in the mountain. But you're right. There's some kind of natural limit. And I suppose there's a limit to the amount of energy I can pull off of this dam, but it's a large number. It's a lot more than your donkey cart, and it's a lot more than your steam, wood stove, and it's a lot more than your coal power plant. And maybe it's a lot cleaner than burning, gasoline. So I'm an engineer, and you're seeing performance thinking it's random. And that's why it's going to stop. And you're seeing volatility and you're thinking it's random and maybe it'll stop. And here with Bitcoin, the reason Bitcoin's performing is A, it's volatile, but B, it's a more energy efficient state. The water is flowing down 5,000 feet because it's a lower energy state 1,000 feet below the mountain. It's a lower energy state. You've got potential energy in the water and it wants to go to ground, and that's just physics. The 500 trillion gallons of water is $500 trillion. And the $500 trillion of assets are sitting in real estate and currency and sovereign bonds and corporate bonds and artwork and equity. And they're invested in the stock of a company in Africa that's going bankrupt, right? They're invested in real estate in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Nigeria. They're sitting in a warehouse that's crumbling. It's got a 40-year life.
When you go all in on something, I would say that does take conviction. Now, your conviction might be.
How many chairs are you
principles.
sitting on right now?
One.
Are you all in on the chair?
I am all in on the chair.
Like the point really is you put on one pair of glasses. You've got one pair of AirPods right now. You're looking at me through one screen. You're using one microphone. That's a one microphone. Like, you trust it? Is that conviction? Seems kind of scary. Why don't you diversify? Why don't you use 10 microphones? The point really is things in your life. Do you drive in 10 cars at the same time or one car at one time? Do you drive down one street? Aren't you afraid that you're driving down one street? Do you take a different way? So my point really is, if you're you get on one airplane, are you convicted? You put your entire family on the one airplane, aren't you afraid? Ultimately, if you're a rational individual, when you use knives, do you have copper knives, wooden knives, steel knives, aluminum knives, rubber band knives, diamond knives, because you're afraid to commit to the right knife? It's a tool. So ultimately, what I'm saying here is an engineer would look at this and say, I use glass for my windows. I don't use aluminum for my windows because I can't see through the aluminum, right? I use steel beams. People used to use wooden beams. Steel beams work better, right? I use copper for wires because electricity goes through copper better. I don't use aluminum for wires. Right? Am I a radical, convicted, fanatic investor? Or am I just like a rational person that uses copper for wires because copper works better? Right? And my point here is, you live in a society and things are going awry. If you did live in a country and the food supply was cut off, the electricity got turned off, the currency collapsed, and there were riots in the streets, would you still just kind of hang out and use the same rules of thumb you've been using? Or would you say, I think I'm going to exit via the airport where there are no riots if I can get on that plane, and I'm going to go somewhere else? Not because I'm convicted, not because I'm radical, not because I'm a risk taker. No, I'm just going to do it because I'm an intelligent human being, and I notice that it's getting uncomfortable where I am right now. And so that's the way I see this. It's just thinking for yourself using reason.
Should we apply leverage to what's working? Investing, business, life?
Yeah, I think if you have access to leverage under favorable terms, yes. For example, if you want to buy a house and someone will loan you money for 30 years at 2.5%, you should take the mortgage. I mean, your choice would be to work for 20 years and not buy the house, or you could buy the house. And by the way, working for 20 years, but I would say especially there's two elements here. One is, what's the cost of funds, or what's the expansion rate of the money supply? If the money supply is expanding by 7% a year in US dollars, and someone will loan you money at 3% interest, you certainly should take the leverage, because if you buy the $1 million house, then it's going to be worth $5 million, in 20 years, and you will have generated wealth. And if you don't buy the $1 million house, you will work for 20 years and the house will keep getting 7% more expensive, or you'll never get the house. And in 20 years, you'll have nothing. So I think that in an expansionary monetary system, which describes our money system for our lifetimes, it definitely makes sense to take leverage in your personal life if you can do it under fair terms. Like I wouldn't say buy a house with a credit card with 14% interest, right? I wouldn't tell you to go buy $1 million of stock with 90% or 10x leverage mark to market every minute, because if you get 10% volatility, you get wiped out and you lose all your money. So I wouldn't say use mark to market leverage to speculate. That's a bad idea. I would use long duration leverage in order to live better. That's a good idea. Mm-hmm. My advice if you're entering adulthood: focus your energy, guard your time, train your mind, train your body, think for yourself, curate your friends, curate your environment, keep your promises, stay cheerful and constructive, and upgrade the world. If you want to provide prosperity to 8 billion people in the world, if I was speaking to anybody, anyone starting their life or their education, or family said, what should we teach our children in order to make them prosperous? I would say, master the protocols of prosperity. So what are the protocols of prosperity? One of them certainly is math and physics and engineering, right? Those are the science protocols of prosperity. The second would be something like the English language, which is a communication protocol of prosperity. The third would be Bitcoin, an economic protocol of prosperity. Let's come back to the science protocols. Why are they so powerful? Well, because the laws of physics apply without prejudice or bias, everywhere on Earth simultaneously all the time. And so they're not subject to political distortion and ideological distortion.